It was the winter of 208 AD, and along the muddy banks of the Yangtze River, the largest army China had ever seen was getting ready to make history. What happened next would tear apart an empire, give birth to 3 kingdoms, and forever change the course of Chinese civilization. This wasn't just another war over land or wealth. It was the last gasp of a dying dynasty and the beginning of a new era that would echo through time. Picture it. Nearly 250,000 soldiers stretching across the horizon like a living sea of bronze and steel. War banners cracked in the icy wind, horses thundered across the fields, and wagons creaked under enough supplies to feed a city. At the front rode Cao Cao, the most feared warlord in all of China, his eyes locked on a dream that had escaped conquerors for generations. Absolute control of the Middle Kingdom. But the enemies waiting ahead were more dangerous than he ever expected. It wasn't their numbers, Cao Cao's army dwarfed theirs. It wasn't their weapons either, they were outmatched in almost every way. What they had was something else entirely. Something that would turn the Yangtze's waters into fire and transform certain defeat into an impossible victory. By 208, the Han Dynasty, once the mightiest empire on earth, was crumbling after 400 years of rule. Warlords tore the land apart like vultures fighting over scraps. The emperor was little more than a terrified puppet, clinging to a throne that no one respected anymore. Amid that chaos, ambitious men saw opportunity, and none were more ambitious than Cao Cao. Through one campaign after another, he had conquered the entire north, crushing anyone who stood in his way. His victory at Guandu destroyed his greatest rival, and the defeat of the Wuhuan tribes at White Wolf Mountain secured his borders. With the north firmly under his command, only the south remained. There, 2 warlords still refused to bow, Liu Bei and Quan. Their names would become legend, but back then, they were just obstacles standing between Cao Cao and his destiny. Liu Bei claimed royal blood, a distant relative of the imperial line, while Quan, still in his early 20s, ruled the rich riverlands he'd inherited. Their forces were small compared to Cao Cao's massive host, yet neither man would surrender. It should have been a simple conquest. Cao Cao's army would crush the resistance, unite China under his banner, and begin a dynasty to last for centuries. The southern lords would kneel or die. History seemed inevitable, but history, as it turned out, had other plans. As autumn faded into winter, Cao Cao's colossal army marched south. The sight must have been unreal. He claimed 800,000 men followed his banners. Even modern historians, who call that number propaganda, agree at least 250,000 soldiers were on the move. This wasn't an army, it was a migration of iron and flesh. Cavalry from the northern steppes rode beside veteran infantry who'd already conquered kingdoms. Engineers dragged massive catapults and siege towers, while supply wagons stretched for miles, carrying weapons, food, winter gear, and medicine. The ground itself seemed to shake beneath them. But inside that unstoppable force were the cracks that would soon break it apart. Many troops were fresh conscripts from conquered lands, men with little loyalty to Cao Cao. Others were forced laborers, swelling the numbers but adding no real strength. Most of all, his army was built for land battles, not river warfare. These northern soldiers knew nothing of the Yangtze's unpredictable waters. As winter deepened, problems multiplied. Supplies ran thin. Disease spread through the crowded camps. Exhausted men stumbled after marching hundreds of miles without rest. By the time they reached the river, Cao Cao's invincible army was already fraying at the edges. Still, he pressed on, confident that numbers alone would crush any resistance. After all, what could 50,000 Southerners do against 250,000 Northerners? The answer would soon blaze across the waters of Red Cliffs, written in fire, smoke, and blood. The Southern alliance that rose to meet him was born from desperation. Liu Bei and Quan had once been rivals, fighting for control of southern China. Under normal circumstances, they might have destroyed each other long before Cao Cao ever arrived. But these weren't normal times. I'd already faced Cao Cao once and lost. At the Battle of Changban, his army shattered mine, and I barely escaped with my life. My troops were scattered, my supplies gone, and my future hanging by a thread. Alone, I didn't stand a chance against the northern flood moving south. Sun Quan, on the other hand, ruled the rich river valleys of the southeast. He had money, ships, and strong defenses, but only around 50,000 men. No match for Cao Cao's overwhelming numbers. Outnumbered 5-1, he knew he couldn't win alone. Neither could I. But together, maybe, just maybe, we had a fighting chance. That's how our uneasy alliance began, born from desperation and sealed with strategy. I sent my advisor, the brilliant Zhuge Liang, to negotiate with Sun Quan's court. While he worked his magic with words, Sun Quan's own council debated whether to fight or bow to Cao Cao's might. In the end, the decision came down to one crucial advantage we Southerners had. We ruled the rivers. Cao Cao's army was built for land battles, but we'd grown up on the Yangtze. We knew its moods, its hidden currents, and how to use its winds and waters to our favor. That knowledge would prove far more powerful than his endless legions. And then there was Zhou Yu, the man who would become the heart of our resistance. At just 33, he was already famous across China for his sharp mind and striking presence. Tall, confident, and as handsome as the old chronicles claimed, he had both brains and charisma. He saw what others missed. While most generals looked at Cao Cao's army and saw doom, Zhou Yu saw opportunity. He quickly spotted the northern army's flaws. Cao Cao's men were exhausted, many sick, and completely inexperienced in river combat. They'd marched hundreds of miles through disease and hunger. Worst of all, they'd have to rely on ships to cross the Yangtze, and ships could burn. By the time Cao Cao's army reached the river's northern banks, the stage was set for one of the most dramatic showdowns in Chinese history. Across those dark waters, his massive force faced our smaller but determined alliance. Neither side truly knew what was coming, but both understood that China's fate hung in the balance. Winter winds howled through the camps, and in the southern ranks, an old warrior named Huang Gai was quietly crafting a plan that would turn those winds into weapons. The story of Red Cliffs doesn't start with the battle itself. It starts with a mystery that's baffled historians for over 1,300 years. Where exactly did it happen? The name Red Cliffs brings to mind tall crimson cliffs above the Yangtze, but no one knows for sure which cliffs saw the fire that changed an empire. Scholars have argued about it for centuries, pointing to places from Jiayu in Hubei to spots near modern Wuhan. The Yangtze has shifted countless times since 208 AD, hiding any traces of the battlefield beneath its muddy waters. Names changed, landmarks vanished, and the land itself was reshaped by time and nature. But here's what we do know. Somewhere along the middle reaches of the river, deep in what's now Hubei province, two armies prepared for a fight that would change history. It was the perfect place for a naval clash. Wide waters hemmed in by cliffs, narrow channels to trap enemies, and winter winds strong enough to carry both ships and flames. By the time Cao Cao's army reached the river, the rains had swollen it into a dark, restless sea. Across the water, our banners snapped in the cold wind. Between us lay not just a river, but a grave waiting to be filled. Then came Cao Cao's fatal mistake. Knowing his northern soldiers weren't used to water, he ordered the warships chained together. He figured that linking them side by side would make the deck steadier, help his men fight without getting seasick, and turn the fleet into floating fortresses. Massive ships, bound by heavy iron chains, lined the river like an unbroken wall of steel. To Cao Cao it looked like genius. Cao Cao's chained ships sat steady on the water, unmoved by the river's current. His soldiers could march from one deck to another, even lead their horses aboard without fear of the ship swaying. To him, it was the perfect blend of land and sea power, an unstoppable fleet that could fight like an army on solid ground. But from our side of the river, Zhou Yu and the rest of us saw something entirely different. Where Cao Cao saw stability, we saw a trap waiting to be sprung. Those ships, locked together by heavy chains, couldn't turn or separate. If even one caught fire, the flames would race through the whole fleet. What he thought was his greatest advantage would become the spark of his downfall. That's when our plan began to take shape, built around one simple, daring idea: fire. Since the dawn of time, fire had been mankind's greatest tool. Now it would become our deadliest weapon. But burning ships wasn't enough. We needed cunning, timing, and the nerve to bet everything on one risky move. That's when Huang Gai stepped forward. A battle-worn general, poor and orphaned as a child. He'd risen through the ranks by sheer grit and skill. He'd served the Sun family faithfully for 3 generations and earned the respect of every man under his command. And now, in our darkest hour, he came up with a plan so bold it sounded like suicide. The idea was terrifying in its simplicity. Huang Gai would pretend to defect to Cao Cao's side. He'd sail toward the northern fleet under the guise of surrender, claiming he'd seen the hopelessness of our cause. But his ships wouldn't carry soldiers or supplies. They'd be packed with dry reeds, oil, and tinder. Once close enough, he'd light them ablaze and send them drifting straight into Cao Cao's chained ships. Floating firebombs. Everything had to go perfectly. The wind needed to blow just right, to carry the fire toward the enemy, not back toward us. Cao Cao had to believe Huang Gai's surrender was real. The timing needed to be flawless. Too early and the flames would burn the ships before they reached their target. Too late and the northern fleet might scatter. One mistake and the plan and everyone involved would go up in smoke. Zhou Yu saw both the brilliance and the danger. If Cao Cao caught wind of the deception, Huang Gai would be tortured and executed. If the weather changed, the flames could miss their mark or, worse, turn on us. If the northern scouts grew suspicious too soon, they'd sound the alarm and destroy the trap before it ever sprung. But we didn't have a choice. Outnumbered 4-1, a direct fight meant certain death. The fire attack was our only real shot. A single chance to turn Cao Cao's mighty fleet into his own undoing. Then, as if heaven itself approved, the winds shifted. They began blowing steadily from the southeast, straight toward Cao Cao's position. Zhou Yu gave the order. Huang Gai started preparing the ships. These weren't war vessels anymore. They were weapons of destruction. The holds were stuffed with straw, wood, and oil, everything that could burn. On the surface, they looked like harmless transport ships loaded with cargo. Beneath, they were floating pyres, ready to turn the Yangtze into a river of fire. Finally, Huang Gai wrote the letter, the key to the whole ruse. It was a masterpiece of deception, written in the humble voice of a broken man seeking mercy. He claimed he wanted to surrender and bring Cao Cao inside information about our defenses and weaknesses. It was exactly what Cao Cao expected. After all, why wouldn't a southern general defect once he realized resistance was hopeless? Cao Cao thought he understood men like Huang Gai. To him, a veteran soldier would always choose survival over loyalty. It was the logical thing to do. What he couldn't see was the trap waiting for him across the dark, rolling waters of the Yangtze. In our camps to the south, every man was making final preparations for an attack that would turn the mightiest army in Chinese history into a blazing graveyard. The wind was right. The enemy was exactly where we needed them. Everything was in place for one of the greatest military catastrophes the world would ever see. The night before the attack, Huang Gai made his final checks. By dawn, he'd be sailing straight into death itself, carrying with him not just his own fate, but the hopes of every soldier in the Southern Alliance, and maybe the future of China. When morning came, the world seemed to hold its breath. A heavy stillness hung over the river, broken only by the soft creak of wood and the faint slap of water against the hulls. Across the Yangtze, Cao Cao's fleet loomed like a floating city of timber and iron. His banners hung limp in the quiet air, and his soldiers moved about the decks with the calm confidence of men who believed the war was already won. After all, what could a few thousand Southerners possibly do against 250,000 Northerners? But on our side of the river, the air felt charged, like the sky before a storm. Zhou Yu paced the shoreline, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the first ripple of wind to signal our moment. Every part of the plan had been rehearsed a dozen times, but he knew success depended on more than strategy. It depended on wind, water, and luck, forces no general could command. Down by the riverbank, Huang Gai stood beside his fleet of disguised fire ships. To anyone watching, they looked harmless. Merchant vessels loaded with trade goods and supplies. Beneath the canvas, though, the holds were stuffed with oil-soaked reeds and bundles of kindling. The veteran general's face was calm, unreadable, though every man around him knew he was walking into a suicide mission. Then, as the sun climbed higher, the wind began to stir. At first just a whisper, then a steady push from the southeast, blowing straight toward Cao Cao's fleet. On the northern ships, banners started to ripple. On our side, Zhou Yu's pulse quickened. The moment had come. The attack began with the perfect lie, a show of surrender. Huang Gai's small fleet eased away from shore, sails catching the rising wind. Their pace was slow, unthreatening, exactly what Cao Cao expected. From across the water, northern sentries watched with lazy curiosity. They'd already received Huang Gai's letter pledging allegiance, and to them this was just a formality, a defeated general switching sides. But as the ships glided to the middle of the river, something changed. Hidden beneath the tarps, Huang Gai's men moved quickly, spreading more oil, uncovering the kindling, making ready. Small escape boats followed behind, waiting to whisk them away once the fires were set. The wind strengthened. Zhou Yu raised his arm. The signal was given. Across the river, Huang Gai lifted a torch high above his head. Every man on our shore held his breath. Everything, our plan, our lives, our cause, rested on one man and the mercy of the elements. Then Huang Gai shouted, his voice booming across the river. "We surrender! We come to serve the great chancellor." His men echoed the cry. From the northern ships came cheers of triumph, laughter even. Cao Cao's soldiers crowded the rails, eager to witness the final surrender of their enemies. And that's when it happened. Huang Gai dropped the torch. The first ship exploded into flames. The fire roared to life instantly, racing through the oil-soaked reeds and climbing the masts like lightning. Within moments, the next ship caught, then the next. A fleet of burning monsters surged forward, driven by the wind straight toward Cao Cao's chained armada. The northern fleet's reaction was instant and disastrous. The cheers turned to screams the moment they realized what was coming. But by then, it was far too late. The fire ships, pushed by the roaring southeast wind, hurtled toward their targets like flaming arrows loosed from a giant's bow. The first collision hit with a deafening crack. A burning vessel slammed into one of Cao Cao's massive warships, and in an instant, fire leapt from deck to deck. Those iron chains that were supposed to unite his fleet now became his greatest curse. The flames raced along them like living things, spreading from one ship to the next until the entire river seemed to catch fire. Panic tore through the northern ranks. Men who'd never fought on water were suddenly trapped on floating infernos with nowhere to run. Some jumped overboard only to be dragged under by the weight of their armor. Others tried to swim but found themselves choosing between drowning or burning alive. In minutes, the once mighty fleet dissolved into chaos. The Yangtze turned into a sea of fire and screams. Flames clawed at the winter sky, and the air filled with smoke so thick it choked the breath from your lungs. It was as if hell itself had opened on the river. The same wind that carried our fire ships now fed the inferno, fanning it higher and hotter until the separate blazes merged into one monstrous wall of flame. On his command ship, Cao Cao stood frozen, watching his empire burn. The man who had crushed every rival in the north, who'd seemed unstoppable, could do nothing as his dream went up in smoke. His officers shouted for him to flee, but for a long time he just stared helpless as everything he'd built turned to ash. The fire didn't stop with the warships. It leapt to the supply boats and troop transports nearby. Food stores, siege engines, weapons. Months of careful preparation. Everything fed the blaze. Smoke blotted out the sun until day became a dim, smoky twilight. And still, the nightmare spread. Just as Zhou Yu predicted, the flames reached the northern camps along the riverbanks. They swept through tents, wagons, and wooden fortifications, devouring everything in their path. Soldiers who escaped the burning ships found themselves surrounded by the same deadly fire on land. That was when Zhou Yu gave the order. Our fleet surged forward through the smoke, drums pounding, warriors shouting war cries that echoed across the water. What followed wasn't a battle, it was a slaughter. The Northern Army, already broken by fire and terror, couldn't organize a defense. Those who tried to stand their ground were quickly overwhelmed. Officers who tried to rally their men were trampled or cut down. The unstoppable war machine that had conquered half of China collapsed into chaos. The slaughter turned into a chase. As night fell, what was left of Cao Cao's army fled north, stumbling through rain and mud. The roads turned to rivers of sludge. Men sank, drowned, or collapsed from exhaustion. Horses panicked, wagons overturned, and the mighty northern host dissolved into a desperate, starving mob. By the time the fires died and the smoke cleared, the largest army in China's history was gone, reduced to scattered survivors running for their lives. Cao Cao, the man who had come to claim all of China, was now a fugitive himself. His grand ambitions burned to ashes and carried away by the Yangtze's dark waters. But the true weight of that day would only be felt in the years that followed. Red Cliffs wasn't just a victory, it was a turning point. The flames that destroyed Cao Cao's army didn't just save the south. They forged a new balance of power. From those ashes, 3 kingdoms would rise, shaping China's destiny for generations to come.